You are listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast. We aim to model the discipleship conversations that should be happening on couches and around dining room tables. We're trying to grow our imaginations to think of what could and should be as we follow Jesus. We're asking ourselves tough questions about how we are being formed by the world around us, and we're inviting you to listen in. If you find this episode helpful, the best thing you could do is share it with one person and start a conversation with them. But also liking and subscribing, leaving a review, these are all things that are really helpful in growing the podcast and letting more people hear it as well. So it'd be great if you did that as well. All right, on to today's episode.
Andrew Chambers is the head of campus life at Excel College, where he and his wife, Charity, live and serve with their two boys, Evan and Jesse. Before joining the team at Excel in 2017, Andrew served as the regional director of South America for Adventures in Mission, awakening and activating a generation of young followers of Jesus into a kingdom-minded way of life. The team at Excel is pioneering a new old model in higher education where students become wise, mature, and productive adults who live purposeful, fulfilling lives. Amidst cries of "Daddy, snack!" Andrew spends most of his time coaching young leaders, building and cultivating relationships with local businesses for the apprenticeship program, and leading the marketing and recruiting team. We're so glad to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
So I have been thinking about this subject, that the core of higher ed is really rotting.
Yeah.
So to start us off, college, it used to be about pursuing wisdom and maturity, the ancient virtues, and not just about job training. And it seems we've traded lesser virtues in higher ed these days, and even a utilitarian mindset.
Yeah.
What have you observed about how higher ed has changed, and what effect has that had on the last 100 years of Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think you can start out even just watching kind of a lot of the protests are happening right now and everything. I don't want to sound harsh, but the principle of like you reap what you sow. Mm-hmm. And when you looked at the map of like where is this happening, it's happening in kind of institutions that are known historically for sowing that kind of mindset, I guess. And then it's kind of coming back on them a little bit, and that's unfortunate. But we're in a really unique time period where 20 years ago, a lot of the stuff was like bubbling under the surface. As far as like the gender stuff and the heavy activism thing and just all these different value systems that I would say wouldn't align with our faith, wouldn't align with the Christian faith. A lot of that's bubbling under the surface, and then now it's just out there in the open to see, and you're actually seeing the fruit of it as well. Mm-hmm. And so for my kids, I'm actually a little bit less nervous about that because you're actually seeing the fruit wide open out in space, whereas before it was kind of like hidden. But I think, as far as like where college is today, so when you hear about something like, your daughter going to college, when you hear about someone going to college, typically the first question you ask is, okay, what are you going to do? Like, what's the job that you're going to get from college? And so that's almost it. And actually, not even just with people going to college, but even at a dinner party, when you meet somebody for the first time, typically the first question you ask is, well, what do you do? And so we think right there is where we've missed the plot, where we lost the plot, because we are human beings, not human doings. And now God has given us things to steward, right? And he's given us gifts that are for the world. But first and foremost, I'm a human being, made in his image. And so, what happened is 200 years ago, 300 years ago when America was founded, we were founded as an agrarian culture. And so, that was like the one-room schoolhouse, trades, blacksmithing, farming, the very, very much like not globalized, small independent villages that would depend on each other some, but like really doing tight community together. And going to college wasn't a must. It was a privilege. Mm-hmm. And not everyone went to college because not everyone needed to go to college. You didn't need to go to college to be a blacksmith or to be a farmer. Or you went to college if you were going to become a leader of your communities, or a leader of your nation even. And it was about becoming a wise, mature, productive person. That's why they focused on the classics. That's why they started with theology, which is the queen of the sciences. Because if you get theology right, then you'll get philosophy right. But if you have bad theology, you'll have bad philosophy. I think C.S. Lewis said that. And so college was never supposed to be this getting into the economic machine tool or pathway. It was actually supposed to be about forming wisdom and maturity. But, with the Industrial Revolution, which has produced amazing things, there's always a pro and a con, and like, what's the cost?
Mm-hmm.
And so for one is we shifted from everyone, like the majority of the population living in small farming communities, in an actual community, like village type deal where everyone knows everyone, and there's that kind of like mutual accountability and tradition to guide and direct families, to building factories and plants to where actually we can produce more and more and more. And so we became an industrial economy. So when that happened, less people were in the small blacksmithing farming kind of style and getting into the factories more and more. And so the training needed to change from people that could problem solve and think on their own to people that you could be able to replace these jobs easily. And people could build widgets, actual widgets. But you had to have the people that could fit into that economic machine. And so that's actually when a lot of the schooling, not just college, but schooling started to change. And so when we change classes now in schools, like the bell rings, well, what's that reminiscent of? It's the factory.
Yeah, the factory bell.
So we reduced man from made in the image of God to economic man, production and consumption. And so that we could fit into the economic machine. Now, no one would say that's what we were doing, right? But it's kind of just a consequence of what's happening. And so that's when college started getting into a more like Germanic kind of style, which is very utilitarian. And so that's when it became very research-based, very like, we're going to find the next medicines, or we're trying to do our specialists so we can find the next invention. And the people that went into it, the purpose of going into college shifted from becoming wise and mature to going into the economic machine and being able to find literally what we would say is find your place in the economy, which is a good thing to be able to find your place in the economy, because the economy is important, but that became the thing. And so, that happened with the Industrial Revolution. And then over the years, it wasn't until about the 50s and 60s where it started to become, and even then, college wasn't the gateway to the American dream, which it is now. Well, it has been for the last 50 years. I think it's kind of losing that a little bit. But it wasn't until about the 50s and 60s that it became, you have to go to college in order to survive in the marketplace, or in order to thrive in the marketplace. And that's kind of really where it took off into this very utilitarian, what are you going to do? Instead of who do you want to be?
So interesting what you're talking about, economic man and being equipped to engage the economy. And I think about the difference between that utilitarian mindset of man's economy versus a much broader concept that we think about when we're talking about God's economy. The difference between being image bearers who are diverse in their vocations versus being trained to make widgets, but having to almost become a widget yourself to be in and out of the industrial machine. So I'm hearing that. But this fruit that comes of this, this rotten core produces insipid fruit.
Yeah.
That it is where we are diminishing man to where that there's not that richness of expression, not the richness of what it means to taste and see one another's fruit produced in us by a healthy core inhabited by the Spirit.
Yeah.
So it leads well, but I wanted to make sure that if there was more that you wanted to say about this process in history, that you had a chance to do so. Go ahead.
Well, I kind of want to actually just play off what you just said, because I think what happened is, and I just wrote a blog about this, but when you reduce man to economic man, and that's literally not what we were made to be, that works for a while. And there's, a couple of generations before ours where it was like, hey, I'm in the job from a 9 to 5 so I can live for the weekend. I mean, literally, I'm going to live for the weekend and have a good retirement on the golf course. But when you realize that we were made for so much more than that, that lasted for a generation or so, and now we can't actually handle it anymore. And so right now the unemployment rate's the lowest it's been since the 50s, and everybody's pumped about that. But what they're also not talking about is people can't find people to work. And there's people complaining about, like, this generation's lazy, But I think what it really is they realize that they're more than economic man. And because we haven't actually fed their souls, and because we actually haven't breathed life in their souls and helped them know who they are, and that the gifts that God has given them are for the world, and that work is a really good thing. It's actually an outflowing of who you are, not supposed to define you as a person. And they can't handle the 9 to 5 thing, not because they're lazy and all that kind of stuff, but actually because we haven't given them a reason. We haven't shown them how they fit into the world.
I'm hearing two problems that are coming out very clearly in what you're saying, that we do not just diminish people into widgets to perform economic purposes, but that we also need to recognize that college isn't for everyone, and college isn't even doing its original job. So maybe that's a point A and point B in that subset. So help us think about education, true education. It's meant to be about transformation. You become what you behold. And so what are you observing in higher ed in particular that's having a negative impact on culture? You started dipping into what about the now? We've been in the history.
Yeah. So let me tell a couple stories because I think that'll fit that. So we firmly believe at Excel that there needs to be this journey from adolescence to adulthood. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's very human, of like where you're testing your strength, you're learning who you are, who God made you to be, and who are you within your family and community, but also apart from, but interdependent. And somewhere along the way, college became that. Now, I would say it's not that, but it tried to be that. Mm-hmm. And so where you become a man or a woman, you go to college and you come off a man or woman. But for many, it's actually extended adolescence is what's happening. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get the degree so you can get a job, but you're not actually becoming a man or a woman. Mm-hmm. So like when I was in college, I went to University of Memphis, loved the school there. And I went to a smaller Christian college beforehand. The first 2 years of college, we were like staying up till like 3 o'clock in the morning, boiling hot dogs and coffee pots and playing Call of Duty. Not exactly what my parents would say would be like what we sent you to college for, right. And not exactly becoming a man, And it wasn't until I actually got into the marketplace and got into full-time ministry while I was in college that I was like, all right, I got to grow up here, and kind of shifted that, Okay, so that's one story, and then this is going to fascinate you. So this lady named Helene Smallbone. She is the mother of Rebecca St. James and For King and Country. So we sponsored an event she was the keynote at. So she heard us give our presentation because our students, they live in homes. They don't live in dorms. Right. And part of that reason is we don't want them boiling hot dogs and coffee. But like we want them to learn to cook and clean and maintain a home. And tell them when they graduate, you should be ready to build healthy marriages and families.
And make good coffee. Spouses need good coffee to function. Keep going.
And so she heard us say that, and then she was like, so she's from Australia, and she was like, America is the only, she's like, I've traveled all over the world. She's like, you guys are the only developed country that I know of that sends your kids off to live in dormitories for college. She's like, our kids go to university. Like she said uni, they go to uni, but they live in their family still, and then they participate in uni. So I'm not saying no one else does that, but she was like, you're the only country where that's like the norm. And she was like, it's very interesting because it's like you pluck them out of their family and then introduce them to a ton of new ideas and give them no leadership, or the leadership is professors who are just like any idea has equal weight. Instead of saying like, no, this idea has actually been shown to not be very fruitful over the last 2,000 years, and this one has, and that struck me because she was like, that's why I'm fascinated about what you guys are doing in Excel. And so I think, and for me, when I was at University of Memphis, I had a junior biology professor that was like, the Bible's stupid because of evolution, and just I didn't have a foundation or people to wrestle that out with well. And so I feel like one of the main issues that we're seeing today, and we kind of alluded to this with like you reap what you sow a little bit, is for one, we're not teaching people how to grow up in college anymore and become men and women. And you're going there so you can get the piece of paper so you can get the job and maybe networks and connections and all that kind of stuff. So Harvard, Stanford, and Carnegie did a study. The Ivy League, they did a study on why do people get jobs, keep jobs, and get promoted in jobs. And they said 85% of the reason that people get jobs, keep jobs, and get promoted in jobs is soft skills. Only 15% is the hard skill. It used to be that the 4-year degree signified that you had those soft skills.
Go ahead and define for us soft versus hard skills.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So soft skills would be like, so I just went to a conference this weekend and said, what do you think employers ask for most? And everybody was like, can they show up on time? Do they care? Do they have the character and integrity to sustain the job?
Virtue.
Can they take feedback? It's virtue. Can they think critically and problem solve? Do they know how to live well in their financial life? Do they know how to handle conflict well? That's all soft skills. It's like managers are people that know how to handle conflict. They're not the person that's the most skilled at like looking into a microscope. And so that's soft skills. So what employers tell us is, hey, we can do the job training, like how to do the job. But what we can't teach them is how to show up on time, how to take feedback well, how to think critically and problem solve. Like we need you to do that. And so that's one of the things that we do. But I think that's one of the main things that's missing from the current university, there's probably some out there that do it. So I'm speaking generally here. And I think employers have started to realize that over the last 20 years. And so whereas it used to be, we're going to hire kids out of traditional 4-year colleges because we know that they would have been trained in those ways. They don't do that anymore. And so, all the big boys, Google, Tesla, IBM, Apple, for years, they've actually started doing their own training. We're not in the industrial age anymore,
right?
Where change was still fast, but compared to now, change was slow. Change now is, have you read the book Margin? Highly recommend.
All right.
And essentially the whole premise is there's a rate of change that's sustainable, and then it becomes unsustainable, and we're like getting there. And he's talking about in your personal life for as much as you work, but also like the way technology is evolving. And so what happened is, whereas used to be you would hire a kid from college and you would know they're ready to do my job, that's just not the case anymore. And so like even the state of Massachusetts, the governor of Massachusetts put out a executive order in January. It said, unless a 4-year degree is absolutely necessary to do the job that is listed on the website, they're the largest employer in the state, then we are not going to require a 4-year degree for that. So they went and scrubbed the state website, and guess how many jobs still required 4-year degrees? Like 7%.
Wow.
And so it's been this funnel of like, you have to, when I was growing up, you got to get a degree. And not only do you have to get a degree, you have to get a master's degree if you're going to make something of yourself. And don't go into the trades. Don't go into machining. Don't go into the blue collar stuff. You got to go into white collar stuff if you're going to make something of yourself. That was the message we got. And so there was this literal funnel into the 4-year system, and you had to go through it. And so it became less effective at job training. One thing we say is like, it's the least effective and most expensive way to learn a skill. Not only was it becoming less effective at getting us into the marketplace, so employers are unhappy and starting to do their own thing, but then also you have to get your gen eds credits, which are the liberal arts, and the ideologies that are being taught in a lot of colleges are not what we as believers would say would lead to flourishing. And I think you're seeing that now. And so there's this kind of double-edged sword of college can't keep up with the rate of change that comes with the information age. And so these huge university departments literally can't make shifts that fast. You just can't. And they're not putting out the most virtuous people anymore. And then the ideologies that we're getting taught, it's literally a funnel. And so we go into, Wyoming's got the 7-story mountain kind of thing. We literally go into all areas of life with these ideologies that are, I would say, at best, not in tune with the faith and what we think is contributing to flourishing, and at worst, complete opposite of.
Hostile to it.
Yeah.
And so we're creating those who no longer contribute to the flourishing of others, to the flourishing of society. And I'm hearing the touch points of how we're also setting them back in terms of the huge amount of debt as it continues to be a price tag that inflates. So I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about the just ever inflating expense of schooling. How did we get here? What's to be done about it?
Yeah. So I think the current number is like 1.7 trillion in student loan debt. And that's more than credit card debt. It's more than auto loans. This is stuff that people are starting to talk about now, or people have been talking about, but are really starting to talk about. And so right now there's a big fight in Congress over whether we should cancel student loan debt or not. And I think you asked the right questions, but how did we get here? So basic economics. Once debt gets introduced into a system, everything in that system gets more expensive. Why? Because now you can borrow in order to afford it. And so that's why a lot of expats move to certain developing countries where there hasn't been a lot of debt introduced yet, because they can buy a house for $50,000. But if all of a sudden you got loans coming in and people can afford more. And so in the 50s and 60s, that's when the federal government actually, so it started happening with kind of the first GI Bill stuff after the 40s, when soldiers were coming back from World War II and they started funding them to go to college. But it was really in the 50s and 60s where, and kind of capped off with LBJ in the 60s, where he said literally said this: every American deserves access to college, and therefore they passed an act that the federal government would not only encourage taking out loans so that you could go to college and have access to it, but also start backing them and subsidizing them. And so all of a sudden, there was money available for everyone in the country to go to college, and that just was not the norm until then. And it changed this precedent around from like you go to college if you need to and if you want to be in certain fields to everyone needs to go to college. And we just started pumping money into it. And since that time, the cost of college, this professor at NYU, his name is Scott Galloway, he wrote a book called Post-COVID, and he actually is talking about the decline of colleges and how he thinks there's going to be a huge consolidation in the industry. The big ones are going to get bigger. The small ones are going to get eaten, and we hear every week about a college closing. Yeah. And he said that the cost of college has gone up 1,600% since the 60s, which is more than the cost of healthcare.
That's crazy.
And I mean, need you to say more, like,
right.
And then the question is, has the quality gone up that much? And most of us would say no, right? And so the average person has $37,000 in student loan debt right now. And again, it makes sense if you're going to be a doctor and you're making $500,000 a year and you've got $100,000 in student loan debt, like that's fine. Right. But what about if you're going to be a mechanic or a teacher and you're paying that? It's just not. And there's colleges now in the Northeast that are starting $90,000 in tuition. Wow. So it's literally crippling. You know, I just watch a lot of stuff economically, and big companies like Target right now, when they're forecasting for their next year's profits and everything, are taking into account of, are we going to allow deferral of student loan debt again? Because the majority of their shoppers have student loans, and that's a big deal for their discretionary income.
Here at the Living Room Disciple, we have been in prayer for all those affected by the devastation of Hurricane Helene. And this is a storm that touched close to home for us, as our dear co-host Kelsey lives in a community that was deeply impacted, which is why you may be hearing her voice a little bit less often on the next several episodes. Now, as her community and many others like it continue to rebuild, we wanted to ask two things of you. First, would you make a conscious decision to not forget and move on, to continue in prayer for these communities and for those suffering and struggling, to pray for those who are trying to practice the gift of presence in these communities, a ministry of listening and connecting? And secondly, would you consider donating to a reputable organization that has their hands and feet on the ground in these devastated areas? We asked Kelsey who she's seen doing great work in her area, and she recommended both Samaritan's Purse as well as the Adopt a Need initiative in Western North Carolina. The link to each of those is in the show notes, and I hope that you will consider supporting these communities, whether that's in prayer, with your finances, or both. Now, back to the episode.
Wow. I mean, the complexities that you've mentioned just in this last section. And in similar time in history, the initiatives that were taken to allow for everybody to own their own home, like there were these initiatives taken about this. It's interesting to be able to have more of the context and think about what has driven us towards the place where it's not accessible to have our own home. And these initiatives were happening at the same time and had everything to do with a credit mentality. And so thank you for the way that you cause us to look through more focused lenses on even greater problems. And bringing it back to, it puts more pressure on, it pushes us into the need for great care with how we are training up our young people and equipping them. And I'm thinking about what you said, basically the 4-year traditional degree, it's lost its value. It's losing its status as the gatekeeper to the marketplace, to the American dream of having our own homes. We're having to think more creatively about all of this. So help me think about apprenticeships and why these are a creative and effective route to the marketplace instead. And I know that this is something that's not unique to the United States of America. So what have you seen around the globe?
Yeah, it's great. That's why this is like my favorite thing to talk about. So,
I love it.
So when you were going to be a blacksmith in the 1700s, you didn't go to college. You went and set up under a blacksmith. You stoked his fires. You beat his irons, and he's like, hey, this is the shape we make, and he plunged it under the fire. You struck the hammer with it. He struck the hammer. I mean, I literally watched a guy do this with his kid a couple of years ago. That was just how things worked. Like, so apprenticeships are not this new fancy thing. They're actually like the way that like tradesmen from all of history, and when I say tradesmen, I don't just mean construction workers, and that's a thing in America that we'll talk about, but like I mean lawyers and accountants have learned a skill and have gotten into the marketplace. It's literally through apprenticeships. And we lost it with the Industrial Revolution because it wasn't just, I'm going to be a blacksmith now. We need 1,000 people to work in this factory. And so America is dead last among developed countries in apprenticeships. And when we think apprenticeships, we think electrician, construction worker, plumber, which are all, by the way, great jobs. And you can make 6 figures a year right now being an electrician and a plumber. Provide great services to people that machines are not going to take. Everyone thought machines were going to take those jobs, but they're taking the graphic designer's job.
They don't have the fine motor skills.
Yeah. And so like in Europe, this is like a very normal thing. And so what happens is if you need to go to a 4-year school to do your job, like if you're going to be in the medical field, if you're going to be in the engineering field, go to a 4-year school. That's amazing. But if you don't, like there's alternative paths available. And so like in Europe, if you're going to be in finance, if you're going to be in IT, if you're going to be in the trades, if you're even actually medical, if you're going to be in a lot of medical stuff, they do it through apprenticeships. And so you either get a 4-year or you get apprenticeships or you take a gap year, but there's a pathway for everyone. Whereas we've shoved everyone into the 4-year pathway. And so I went to the Apprenticeships for America conference in DC this year, and everyone was talking about, so I think in 2012, America's actually making some headway here. It's like in 2012, there's like $30 million for apprenticeships. Now there's like $300 million, which in the federal, I think colleges get like $50 billion a year. So it's still a drop in the bucket, but they're making some headway. And so what we found is they're still the most effective way into the marketplace, because who better to teach me a skill in this profession than the person that's actually doing it day in and day out, instead of a professor that's going to maybe take tests on it.
Right.
So there's a ton of apprenticeship programs out there that are 1-year, 2-year, 3-year long, depending on the profession. And you're getting paid to learn. You earn as you learn. Whereas in college, I got to go work a full-time job while I'm in school full-time, and I'm paying loans to survive, essentially, for a lot of people. And actually, in this space as apprenticeships, you're actually getting paid as you're learning. And you start, if you're an electrician, you start just running line for them, and then they actually teach you how to put the sockets in and put those together. And then, it's literally, you level up as you go. And so, whatever your political leaning, what some of the Biden administration has done is in the new CHIPS Act and some of the new bills they're putting out, it's got funding for 1 million apprenticeships in there. That's 1 million. And so it's actually changed the game for a lot of people, because so employers are actually being encouraged to take on apprentices. But something unique that I'll say is, so right now the community colleges run apprenticeships in most states. What I'm hearing from employers is they're not very good at it. They're decent at the training side, but the employer's the best at training. They know what they need. And then also you got to deal with, bureaucracy and budgets, and are enough people taking the classes and all that kind of stuff. And so what people were talking about at the conference was very interesting, was like, how do we get employers encouraged to actually take on apprentices more? Because it seemed like a roadblock was actually getting employers to want to do it. And they were talking about funding. We need to get them more funding. Then they'll take on more apprentices. So I kind of like poked my head up in the back, and I just raised my hand. And I said, what if the apprentices actually had the character and integrity to do the job that they were getting hired for, and so they would stay with the employer for 10 years?
Right.
Wouldn't that solve a lot of the funding problems as well? Because like turnover costs money. And everybody kind of looked at me for a second. And they're like, yeah. And like a couple people around me just like, yeah, you're right. We're making some headway there from a governmental level, but we still need to think about the virtue level.
Yes. And
so you can get, especially with YouTube now, you can get information and knowledge anywhere. And that's the thing. I mean, Google, you want to work at Google, there's a $39 a month Coursera course that Google has put out where they're doing IT, UX, UI development, cloud, everything. And Google developed it, and they've got all these companies they got partnerships with. But what they're still not teaching is the character development. And so you can make $150,000 a year and be miserable, or not have the character integrity to sustain the job. And so it's got to be this kind of holistic thing. But all that to say, apprenticeships are not, the trades kind of started the apprenticeships here, but they're not just for the trades anymore, and they're actually growing, which is a really good thing, I think. So
as I hear you, I think about the reasons why so many children follow in the footsteps of their parents, because we are wired for relational learning, and we're wired for experiential learning, as in the way that we learn the best is through relationship and through experience.
Yeah.
And so even if we have a bunch of formalized schooling to train us to do something, we will probably return to the thing that we experienced the most mentoring in, the most exposure to when we were young.
Yeah.
And it doesn't spell doom. I'm not saying that with this doom-like perspective. I'm saying it with this hopeful perspective that our attention to the way that we actually learn and our elevating those types of experiences over schools that are trying to catch up with that understanding of the way education works.
Yeah.
Because they're talking experiential learning, and they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Talk about a model that can't pivot quickly.
Yeah.
It's a huge Titanic of a model that has been going one direction for so long and isn't looking creatively and isn't thinking about families, which is a place, of course, where that virtue and vocational training all begins.
Yeah.
But of course, we're talking about an arc into a specific stage of life where we need more than parents, because young people are looking, wait a minute, I might be a little different than my parents. I'm looking for another version of apprenticeship. I'm looking for a greater community in which I can grow. So describe to us how the Excel model really contributes to this type of thinking for young people. And I want you to also push into this principle you call the with principle of Jesus and what it means to do life in a true multi-generational community.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. And so, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Helene, small bone. And so you've heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, and it's true. Just like your parents and also your immediate circle, that's who raises it. And so, for the last 150 years, we've shopped that out to the school system, which is the government, and the reason the homeschooling movement is literally doubling year over year over year. So when I was growing up, homeschool was kind of like the weird, whatever. It's not that anymore. It's because families have started realizing, like, I'm not going to shop out the education and discipleship of my children to anyone else. No matter if it's a great teacher who means really, really well, that's my God-given responsibility. And so they do that until they're 18. And then for years, most people's like, okay, now you have to go to university. Hopefully they carry on what I started. And the answer to that is usually no. And so what we did, and so Excel College is part of Excel Life, which is like larger ministry. And so what we've done is, like, you look at the early church, and I mean, it's very simple. Like, you do life together, you break bread together, you love each other, like, you say you're sorry, and they multiplied that way, like multiplied. And so we realized, like, church is a people, not a building. And if we're actually gonna, like, live this kingdom way of life, we have to do it together. And so what we did was we took an old bed and breakfast and turned it into a community center, and bought up a bunch of homes and built a bunch of homes around. And so our students actually live on campus, but so do our in homes, not in dorms, and with an actual kitchen with, like, a stove and, like, a skillet on top that you can cook on, and cook, clean, learn how to maintain the home. And our faculty and staff live on campus as well. And so I've got students, like, that'll knock on my door at, like, 11 o'clock at night, be like, can I talk to you about this? Or like, if I'm doing a coaching session, I'll be like, here, hold this diaper for me. Well, it's like real. And so Jesus with principle, he chose 12 to be with him for 3 years, to be with him. And so we read a ton about the miracles. We read about the teachings, the Sermon on the Mount. But then the question is, what is happening in the in-between time when they're walking from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and there's, like, dust on their feet. And I think that's why I love The Chosen so much. They do such a good job of showing, like, that in-between space. Right. And we think most of life happens in that in-between space, and most of discipleship happens in that in-between space. And so what we realized is, like, we can't disciple by just a cup of coffee once a week. It actually has to be life on life. And so if parents are going to send their children into a space for 3 or 4 years, shouldn't it be a space that's going to help a young adult grow spiritually, intellectually, practically, professionally, missionally, in all of those areas? And so for us, that was huge. And so, like I said, all of our faculty and staff live on campus. The students are working. We're in the community of Black Mountain. There's like 5 businesses in Black Mountain you can go to and not see one of our students working. Like our faculty and staff, their kids have soccer games, and there's like 40 students in the crowd, and everyone's like, why are these college kids at this soccer game? Like literally just doing life together, not off like in the middle of nowhere doing it, like actually engaged in the life of the city, because we think that's what the early church did. They like super engaged in the life of the city. And so that's our model. So that's why we've actually moved to 3 years on the dot, and we don't do this long summer breaks anymore, because there's like a momentum that's built in education and discipleship, and we want to keep it going. And so we tell people all the time, some of our hardest work is not done in the classroom. It's actually done helping kids grow spiritually, relationally in the home, and in other aspects of life. So
I love that. I'm so thankful for you bringing us to that model, that with model, and the as you go model. I think that comes from Luke 9, if I'm remembering correctly, that he was talking about the work that the disciples would be doing as they go.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings to mind the fact that some of them were tent makers as they became apostles, but what they were learning was to do all of life for the Lord's glory, and they were learning as they went, and they were teaching as they went. And so what a beautiful recentering on what we see as the lovely model of the way that Jesus poured into his followers. And this model, accessible to us to read about, to meditate on, to reinstall in our lives, to learn how to install in our lives as believers. Because in every generation, it's this new process of learning the how of this. I love what you've described, the richness, the village, the watch how I parent. I'm going to coach you about what you're about to do, but you're also experiencing what it means to be a father, to be a mother. And that particularly strikes a chord with me regarding how we re-engage young men. And this could be an entire episode itself. We see so many arrows pointing to the need to re-engage boys, young men, men. So you don't have to cover all the bases.
Okay.
But I really want you to talk about how the Excel model is such an engaging model for young men.
The reason the church has failed to engage young men for a while is kind of like, does our vocation matter? And does me being an electrician for the glory of God matter? Does me being a machinist for the glory of God matter? And so the reason like we're seeing a lot of these young guys come alive is, and I'll be honest, like, so we do the Socratic method classroom part, and so they're not getting lectured at, they're actually engaging and discussing and leaning in together and trying to accomplish a goal as a unit of like, let's get to this place where we understand the author and we can actually come to some cool conclusions here. But even with that, for some of the guys, like they're ready to get in the world and get their hands dirty, and like metaphorically. And so a lot of our guys are doing the electrical or doing the machining, but then there's one of our guys who's doing real estate, and I think the question is like, a young man was made to give his gifts to the world into like, in John Elder's book, Wild at Heart, essentially, like a mission to accomplish and the beauty to rescue. It's like, have we engaged our young guys with that? And I think that's something we're still learning as we go, and still like really trying to build this out of like, and we've done it kind of naturally, but we're also thinking like even programmatically, how do we actually instill this more? We've got, so I'll give a shout out to Tom. He was one of our house captains. He got married. He now works on the construction team, but he's one of our coaches now. And he was amazing at building brotherhood. So amazing at leading into intentional conversations at dinner. And then being like, we're going to go camping for a weekend, and we're all going to just like spend the whole weekend with our shirts off and like kill the fish and eat it. And like, but like actually creating like vulnerability in men, which is really tough, and a space where men can be safe to be vulnerable and can safe to like try things and fail, and that's okay. But then also like figure out what are their gifts and what are their strengths and how can they give those away in the world. And that's when you'll see young men come alive. What we found is like when you give them responsibility, they rise. If you don't, you got trouble on your hands,
Alternative to masculinity as entertainment, like that big conference that was done by a church with I think the sword swallowing. This is a very different thing that we're talking about, even when we're embracing the manly expressions, but there is that difference. Developing vulnerability towards developing virtue.
That's such an important part, because like the masculinity part is about virtue. And so when we talk about masculinity, we're not talking about just the guys that are in trades that are doing this. We got a bunch of guys in our creative arts program that are, doing audio engineering and worship, photography, that I think are very masculine, just because, like you were talking about, like they learning how to like walk in that vulnerability well, but like rejecting passivity, taking responsibility, and like learning that phase. I think that's when you see a man come to life.
It harkens back to a book to Andy Crouch, but his book, Playing God, that has to do with redeeming the gift of power. And this goes hand in hand with masculinity, though it is not merely. I mean, we all are given power that we need to use in the world, but what I'm hearing about redeeming masculinity pairs with this for me.
Yeah.
That we're seeking to help men to discern their strengths, to use it for good in the world, to recognize that those things are good and therefore create good in the world. As we close, I want to give you any opportunity, if you have anything else that you wanted to share with us before we give some closing thoughts from Scripture.
I think just what I would end with is the first colleges were Christian colleges. It just is what it is. And if we as a church want to see our young people come alive again and do well, and if we as a generation want to see the generation behind us doing well in the marketplace, being able to inspire them into being who God has made them to be is going to accomplish both of those things. If we reduce them to economic man and call them lazy and tell them that they're not good enough and they're not working hard, it's not going to work. But actually allowing them space to come alive and learning who God has made them to be while getting them a solid foundation and helping them develop their skills and test their strength is what we've got to do as a church. That discipleship aspect is huge, huge, huge. And that's why I think Christians need to stop critiquing, right? Copying, and actually start creating again. Can we create these spaces where our young people can come alive? For us at Excel, one of our keystone verses is John 17:21. It's Jesus' high priestly prayer. He says, Father, I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one. As you are in me, Father, and I am in you. May they be in us so that the world will believe that you sent me. And the question is, how is the world going to know that Jesus is real? It's like by the way that we do life together.
The Living Room Disciple podcast exists to explore the ways we are formed by our experiences, our culture, our beliefs, and our habits. And we are passionate about seeing followers of Jesus transformed to live as Jesus lived. For more information or to support our work, visit livingroomdisciple.com today. We want to thank Micah Pop for producing the podcast, Eric Church for getting it to you, and Daniel Ramirez for composing the music. And thank you for listening to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.